Good morning. So many of us in this room have had tremendous opportunities because of technology. We've had our lives transformed, we've seen new opportunities, we've gotten to see how we could transform politics. It's a really impressive set of things that have gone on because of what we've experienced. We're seeing this with what's happening in the world around us. There are amazing examples of things that we can account for because of technology. Yet, for as brilliant and wonderful as all of this is, and all of the things that we can talk about today, I'm also worried about some of the things that aren't happening. And I'm particularly worried about some of the dangerous underlying rhetoric that we start to say when we think about technology. Given what we've experienced and what we witness, many of us believe that technologies can be these great equalizers. They can bring everybody on board, they can make it a welcome, lovely place, and that anybody can participate if only they have the access. That technologies will revitalize democracy, and we won't have to worry about all of the different things if we can just get this into people's hands. What if this wasn't so? What if this is not what's going on? So there's nothing more tricky than standing up in a room full of passionate people interested in transforming technology at a conference on big ideas and ask you to see something that's sort of really scary to look at. The fundamental issues of racism and classism, inequality, and social stratification in this country. Now, I'm going to do so anyhow because I'm sort of a masochist and I'm looking forward to the critiques I might get. But I also want to do so because it's really critical that we start looking at some of the things that we don't necessarily want to confront. So I'm going to ask you to step back away from the hyperbole, away from the dreams of what might happen, and to think about what's actually happening for certain people across this world, and in particular in the United States. To think about the issues of inequality, and to think about your own privilege in this environment. As you sit here on your BlackBerries and your iPhones, playing with your laptops, connecting with people on Twitter, and assuming that everybody else is doing this. For years, we've talked about it in terms of access. We've thought that this is just a matter of the great digital divide, and that if we put technology in the hands of everybody, that all of this would go away. That what we're seeing is as people get equal levels of access, what they do using these systems is fundamentally different. And those differences are what play out in ways that affect us as we think about technology and policy. So rather than staying in the land of abstract, I'm going to go straight to a case example. Now, first off, how many of you in the room use Facebook on a regular basis? How many of you in the room use MySpace on a regular basis? Look around. 2 weeks ago, ComScore released new data that basically said that MySpace and Facebook were neck and neck. 70 million unique users on both sites. Okay? Now, of course, in the media, the way that this rhetoric was put out is that MySpace is dying, that Facebook is finally surpassing MySpace. But what we're seeing is 70 million unique users is really significant. It's the same number as what was going on last year. It's the same number as we saw a year ago. Now, given the lack of monetization in this space, one can reasonably argue that, Facebook's success and growth over the last year is better business-wise. But is it necessarily what's going on technologically? One might assume that Facebook and MySpace users are just finally overlapping, that they're the same. My guess is from looking around the room that that's not even close to being true. There is not a lot of overlap in users, especially amongst the adult population. But what's actually going on? Why are we seeing numbers like this that conflict with our realities in this kind of privileged environment of everybody using Facebook? Now, the key to understanding this actually starts from the teenagers. They're an amazing population for making sense of what's going on in trends that are larger and more expansive than what's necessarily in the adult space. For those who aren't familiar with my work, I'm an ethnographer. I spend a lot of time running around the United States talking to people about how they use technology. And for the last 4 years, I've been traversing the United States talking to American teenagers. During the 2006 to 2007 school year, I started noticing a trend, one that made me start to wonder what was going on. There were teens that were using Facebook and teens that were using MySpace, and there were teens that were using both, but the divisions were really becoming salient in really critical ways. At the beginning of the 2006 school year, the question teens would ask were, are you on MySpace, yes or no? And by the end of the 2006 to 2007 school year, the question had transformed to MySpace or Facebook. Now, in analyzing the data of what teens said to me, one can reasonably see this as a matter of individual choice in a competitive market. There are plenty of teens who will tell you that they are on one or the other as a matter of personal preference. having to do with the features, the functionality, the specific elements of the sites. There are also teens who will talk about it as design and issues of usability and what they like in terms of interfacing with the actual system. Teens will also talk about how their perceptions are quite different, about what they think the affordances might mean or how they perceive sites in relation to issues such as safety, right? Larger cultural stuff. Of course, the dominant reason that teens will explain is that they're on one or the other because their friends are there. Now, all of this would be really fine and dandy if friendship and aesthetics and values weren't inherently intertwined with issues of race, socioeconomic status, education, and other factors that usually make up how we think about the notions of class. But they are. The further into the analysis you get, the more uncomfortable the data starts to feel. I'm not really into racism, but I think that MySpace now is like more ghetto or whatever, and Facebook is all, not that people who have Facebook are mature, but it's supposed to be like, oh, we're more mature. MySpace is just old. As you start to see this, it starts to get a little bit more sticky. That quote says a lot about the distinction about MySpace and Facebook, but choice isn't the only issues of functionality. It's about the social categories. And here's where we start to see things get a little bit more intense. My school is divided into the honors kids. I think that's self-explanatory. The good, not-so-honors kids, the wanksters, they pretend to be tough and black, but when you live in a suburb in Westchester, you can't claim much hood. The Latinos and Hispanics, they tend to band together even though they could fit into other groups. And the emos kids, whose lives are always filled with woe. We were all in MySpace with our own little social networks, but when Facebook opened its doors to high schoolers, guess who moved and guess who stayed behind? The first two groups were the first to go, and then the wanksters split with half of them on Facebook and the rest on MySpace. I shifted with the rest of my school to Facebook, and it became a place where the honors kids got together and discussed how they were procrastinating over their next AP English essay. Teens and adults use social categories and labels to identify people around issues of values and taste, social positioning. As teens choose between MySpace and Facebook, the sites take on the frames of those social categories. Nowhere is this more visible than amongst the language of teens who chose Facebook over MySpace. The higher castes of high school moved to Facebook. It was more cultured and less cheesy. The lower class were usually content to stick to MySpace. Any high school student who has a Facebook will tell you MySpace users are more likely to be barely educated and obnoxious. Like Pete's is more cultured than Starbucks, and Jazz is more cultured than bubblegum pop. And like Macs are more cultured than PCs. Facebook is a cooler caliber than MySpace. These quotes, as I'm saying them, should start making you think. They're a little bit discomforting when you start to hear the language that people are using. But of course, as adults started to engage in these sites, a whole new twist came around into how this was perceived. It was perceived in the language of maturity. Facebook is for old people versus Facebook is more like adultness. This language of maturity is really interesting because one thing to keep in mind in academic literature is that we find that teenagers from wealthier, more educated backgrounds are more willing to participate in environments alongside adults than those from poorer backgrounds. The thing to note about these quotes is that Caitlin prefers MySpace because she doesn't want to be with old people. And Melanie actually very much values the ability to be around people who are adults as part of what she's doing. Now, one thing to also keep in mind is that the teens who prefer Facebook are far more likely to be condescending towards those who use MySpace than vice versa. Teens who use MySpace will lament Facebook users as stuck-up, goody-two-shoe, the good kids, but they're not nearly as harsh in their language of Facebook as Facebook users of those who use MySpace. Now, there's many potential explanations to how these are going on, why these things happened. Right? The first comes from its origin points. We can't dismiss this. MySpace came out first and attracted 20-somethings, urban 20-somethings. It spread to teenagers through their older siblings and cousins, as well as those who were attracted to indie rock before spreading into teens through those connections. Facebook, on the other hand, started from Harvard. It spread originally to the other Ivy Leagues, and then you had to be in a certain class of college before you could get access. As it spread to the teenagers, it was the teens who were college-bound, and particularly those who were Ivy League-bound, who desperately sought access to the site. They were the early adopters, and the teens who joined on to Facebook from that were the ones most likely to be connected to those who were bound for such universities. Of course, another explanation that we can talk about has to do with fashion and fads. MySpace was first, and people got sick of it. And Facebook came next, right? Very simple. This would be certainly true for teens and adults, but it would only make sense if Facebook were truly dead. And I would argue 70 million unique users is not truly dead. And if it was a matter that MySpace wasn't actually gaining new users, even in the United States. The difference is who are those users and are you likely to know what's going on with them? The fact that this division goes on, it means that it's not cleanly fashion and fads, or rather that fashion and fads are leading different populations to different sites depending on a whole variety of things going on. So here lies the reality that makes it really hard and messy to deal with. It wasn't just anyone who left MySpace to go to Facebook. In fact, if we want to get to the crux of what happened, we might as well come out and be honest with ourselves. What we're seeing is a modern incarnation of white flight. Whites were more likely to choose Facebook. The educated were more likely to choose Facebook. Those from wealthier backgrounds were more likely to leave and choose Facebook. The press, an institution that stems from privilege, narrated MySpace as the dangerous underbelly of the internet, while Facebook was the utopian savior. And here we get back to Kat's point. MySpace has become the ghetto of the digital landscape. And many of us from more privileged environments have gotten into the habit of crossing the street like we always do to avoid the riffraff. The fact that digital migration is revealing the same social patterns as urban white flight should send warning signals to all of us. It should scare the hell out of us. Because what we think about it and the language we're hearing from teens to explain it, explain why they're choosing Facebook over MySpace, should alarm us. Those who are from privileged backgrounds tend to be far more condescending towards those who are using MySpace than vice versa. Many of us in the room come from extremely privileged backgrounds, and we want to help those from less privileged backgrounds. This language is actually the root of where we get into ourselves into some really sticky points, because our language and mannerisms reflects a certain condescension that we hear reflected in our teens' voices. We hear said over and over again by our own children. I highlight this because I think we need to think twice about when we dismiss or devalue popular trends and environments based on the user populations, because more often than not, we're actually dismissing them because of the user populations. We're dismissing them because there are aesthetics and values that we don't understand. And often when we're scared of specific environments, we're marking our understanding of culture values based on these. Take, for example, the moral panics surrounding MySpace for the last couple of years. If you're a parent in the room, you're hard-pressed not to be terrified by MySpace and the potential for sexual predators. You've heard it in the news, you've heard it over and over again. Yet the data shows a very, very different picture. I've spent the last year and a half staring at the details of the data, and what we see is that MySpace is no more risky than any other online space, and is often less risky than chat rooms and other spaces that we see online. And that the reality of the sexual predator is actually looks more like a young teenager engaging intentionally with an older man in a form that takes on the idea of statutory rape. Is it problematic? Yes, extremely so. But it's not actually the same image that we get and the fears that we get. And the fears that we're manifesting of sites like MySpace are the same fears that we manifest of public cities and environments we live in. And I can't help but wonder if the fears actually stem more from a fear of certain kinds of sexuality than they do from the actual risks that these spaces prevail. So, while teens are the starting points of this, it's percolated through adults as well, and more explicitly so. Unlike teens who are straddling MySpace and Facebook, most adults are active on one or the other and not both, unless they have a specific professional reason to do so. Many of you know people who have joined Facebook in the last year, but numerous adults have also joined MySpace in the last year. And my guess is that not many of you know these folks. In many ways, adult worlds are even more divided than teenagers. Adults are less likely to know adults who aren't like them, as noted by the fact that this is a very democratic, biased environment. There's a notion in sociology called homophily. It means birds of a feather stick together. Whites know whites, Democrats know Democrats, urbanites know urbanites, etc., etc. And before you immediately start listing the people that you might think you know that are different than you, start to realize this is the auto reaction when we deal with an uncomfortable truth that we don't like to actually face. More colloquially and sort of snarkily is referred to my black friend. It's extremely problematic the way we live in these very segregated worlds, in a world where we think that these boundaries are actually collapsing. And more importantly, the digital technologies are manifesting and reproducing these in ways that we have to face. So one thing to keep in mind about social media, the internet mirrors and magnifies all of the pre-existing dynamics. And it makes different kinds of realities much more visible. Racial divisions in the United States are not shocking to anyone, but the fact that they're being reinforced and reinscribed through technology should make us all worry a little bit. You know, the fact that schools are integrated, you can see the racial rifts in what goes on, and as teenagers actually place friendships online, you can see the fact that they're not nearly as integrated as we might think in public discourse. So why am I telling you this, right? This is really uncomfortable. And, how do I deal with the fact that, MySpace and Facebook are divided by race, class, education, and other factors? I'm telling you this because it matters. And we need to start talking about the implications before we continue to reinscribe them as we think about technology in these spaces. We have to think about the fact that when people are structurally divided, they do not share space with one another, and they do not communicate with one another. This can and does breed intolerance. It's critical to address issues of homophily because of the socio and economic implications for them. This comes out all the time in politics. The classic example is around gay rights and gay politics. What we find is the #1 predictor for whether or not people are supportive of gay rights policies are whether or not they know anybody who's gay. Well, we also see this around issues of race. You're much more willing to address these issues when you know people who are different than you, when you're faced with the struggles that they face. Social network sites complicate a lot of this in different ways. They're not like email, where it doesn't matter if you're on Hotmail or Yahoo. When you're on Facebook or MySpace, you can't communicate with people on the other site. You can't friend people, you can't talk to them, you can't send messages. There's a cultural wall between users. And if there's no way for people to communicate across the divide, you can never expect them to do so. People are already divided, and we cannot expect technology to automatically integrate them and generate cultural harmony. And most of you on these sites think of them as social networking sites. But in fact, these aren't actually networking sites. They're where people reinforce their social network, not where they meet new people. The vast majority of people who use these sites do so to connect with people they already know. But more directly about you, what matters around this is issues of politics and democracy. You need to understand that these divisions exist. You need to understand that if you're sitting on Facebook, you're only seeing a fraction of the population speak out and be loud. If you're sitting on Twitter, it's a very specific minority that you're viewing. And that minority looks a lot like you. And that as you're engaging with politics and politicians, if you're starting to think about the ways that they should engage with these sites, you've got to realize that what you're seeing online is a very limited scope of what's going on. If you're trying to get a sense of people's public opinion, what you're seeing is a very specific sense of what's going on. The question is how you look beyond that. In many ways, the internet is providing a next-generation public space. Unfortunately, it's also bringing with it next-generation divides, second-class citizenship. The public sphere was never accessible, and I think that we need to also think before we glorify the past. Right? Scholars like Habermas were obsessed with the fact that it was the bourgeois public sphere, not the broad public sphere. The digital public sphere, as we get excited about the possibility of bringing in new people, we need to account for the fact that it may not be bringing in all of the new people that we think are being brought on. And furthermore, not everybody has the skills to understand or engage with the public sphere, even if they have access. If you think civics education is in bad shape in this country, take a look at media literacy. Right? What goes on is not just a matter of getting access or knowing how, but it's about being in the networks. Most likely you learned to use Twitter because you knew people around you who used Twitter. You learned to make sense of these spaces because of the people around you. But not everybody has those skills. Furthermore, what's the meeting point for these spaces? If it's a question of divide between Facebook and MySpace, which one are you choosing to be? Whose voices are you choosing to listen to? Wherever you and your colleagues set a base, these are who you're accounting to. These become your constituents. Are you really willing and wanting to write off a huge portion of the population because they're not engaging with the same service that you're using? In the US, we can talk about the divisions around MySpace and Facebook. For those who work outside of the country, it's important to know that divisions play out in all sorts of technologies in different ways. I've been really fascinated in the last year to track the divisions in India between people who are using Facebook and those who use Orkut. We're seeing similar caste right structures. And divides also play out inside sites, right? Consider the beloved Twitter. For starters, this is a small percentage of Americans, let alone international audience. Teens are completely non-participatory on these sites for all intents and purposes. But even those who are part of it aren't necessarily communicating with the people that you're talking to. For example, even though we saw the Iranian election trending for a long time, the vast majority of users never saw a single post about Iran. Right? Now that said, we saw this change radically as we saw Michael Jackson come into the landscape. And of course that trended so fast that it took the Iranian election immediately off the scope. Why? Because a lot more people are following 50 Cent and Miley Cyrus and engaged in communities where it's about fandom and around celebrity than they are necessarily about politics. So just because a site can support different kinds of politics doesn't mean that you're actually reaching the audiences that are necessarily participating there. So talking about inequality and social stratification is difficult and messy, and I've been nervous as anything trying to get this talk together. I've been living inside the data trying to make sense of it, but we don't have a language for talking about these in very comfortable ways. We don't even have a language for talking about classism in this country, and we usually rely on British notions in order to cope with it. So if you don't understand how to talk about these things, it totally makes sense. Most of us who live it and deal with it don't. But I'm asking you to take a moment and embrace some of these issues of inequality as you sort of move forward in your own work. So I'm going to give you a handful of takeaways just to keep in the back of your mind every time you think about technology as we deal with it. First off, social stratification is pervasive in American society and around the globe. Social media does not immediately eradicate the inequality, and rather it mirrors and magnifies what we're seeing in everyday life. It makes social divisions visible in totally new ways. We no longer are able to put them under the ground, but we have an amazing opportunity to actually embrace them and deal with them. Second, there's no universal public online. What we see as choice in social media has to do with structural forces like homophily. And as we think about those structural forces, we have to embrace people and their divisions and realize that we have to account for them in the different spaces they're there. Third, where you go matters. If you're on Facebook, you need to know you're only seeing a portion of the world. If you're on MySpace, you're also seeing only a portion of the world. When you think about your constituents, the people that matter to you, you actually have to count for them in all of the spaces they are at. And you've got to figure out a way to engage with them in all of the different places. And that you've got an opportunity to help bridge some of these divides. The internet has enabled many voices to enter the political fray, but not everybody is sitting at the table. There's a terrible tendency in this country, and especially among politically minded folks, to interpret an advancement as a solution. We have not eradicated racism in this country. We have not eradicated sexism. We have not eradicated inequality. While we've made tremendous strides in certain battles, the war is not over. So what we can do is pay attention to it, because if we walk away and congratulate ourselves for the good things that have happened, we won't actually address the ongoing and problematic inequalities that are part of this life. And the more that we actually embed these issues of inequality into our social media, the more we will genuinely create a second-class citizenship that we will have to address further on. We desperately need to address the issues of access and media literacy, but we also really need to re-engage with the broader conceptual issues around inequality, intolerance, and social divisions. Technology isn't the savior, but it sure can highlight the work we need to do. So my hope for you listening today is that each and every one of you will begin to look at the work you do and think about social media with a critical eye. It's a tremendous time filled with amazing case studies, but it's also a harrowing time where we need to account for some of the problems that are going on. And if we don't, we will further perpetuate them. Thank you for listening.